Dragon Age Veilguard is shaping up to be the biggest meltdown of a franchise in gaming history. Of course, we're talking about the Dragon Age series itself, one of the biggest and most famous RPGs that have come out in the past 30 years. And to see it be destroyed in such a fashion where gamers are not responding to it anymore, where the reviews are criticizing it into oblivion, and the gamers themselves are just simply not approaching the game and even playing it. And I think that's what we're seeing with Dragon Age Veilguard right now, where the players are put off by the entire experience, where they're not even picking up the controller anymore to play the game. And the Steam numbers are reflecting that in some ways. And people are going to say these are successful Steam numbers. To have over 77,000 people playing your game in the second day of the launch day should be an amazing feat for a AAA title. Of course, it would be an amazing number if it wasn't for so much other RPGs and other games in that genre doing so much better. I'm talking about Elden Ring, Cyberpunk, Black Myth Wukong, Baldur's Gate. All of these games have charted over to the 100,000s, peaking around almost 1 million players in their all-time highs. These are the standard numbers that we're expecting from a AAA title costing over $150 million to $200 million simply to make, not including marketing costs. So this is a game that needs to sell a lot of copies to be successful, and it needs to sell a lot of copies just to break even. So having only 70,000 players play your game at its peak while you have these other champions in the industry peaking out at 800,000, 900,000, 1 million people playing your game is an abysmal effort for a large title like Dragon Age. And I think this is going to reflect back on BioWare, where they're going to have to sit with themselves in a tight spot and wonder what type of games are they creating and for what audience are they creating for. Because what we're seeing nowadays within Dragon Age Veilguard itself, we're seeing games made for the developers themselves who have their own personal issues on display. And we've seen this in art in the past, but it's been done more skillfully and with more depth of character and overall expansion of a storyline. This is not the case for Dragon Age Veilguard. We get a game that is as empty as the world that they created, and I think that's a situation with a lot of the characters and the overall environments in Dragon Age, where it doesn't feel like a world anymore. It feels like a human resources manual of how to survive in a fantasy world, and that is just simply not a fun experience for a gamer that is trying to escape human resources right now, because we just came back from work and we're just trying to play a game for fun. And I think that's the situation we're seeing developing, and the response from the gamers themselves. They're coming to a game that is trying to take them back to human resources training after they said something negatively about a minority group in their company. And I think that's the situation that we're seeing right here with Dragon Age, where people are just frustrated. They want to play games for fun, and we're inundated with these progressive activist politics that are just not interesting to the gamers. And seeing some of our old Dragon Age characters pulled down into the mire and muck of this, where it just doesn't even make the game fun or interesting anymore, specifically when you have poor dialogue and overall interaction with characters. I feel like the characters are one of the most monotonous characters I've ever seen in gaming, where they're just spouting out fantastical terms because that is just what you do in a fantasy. You say fantastical terms and you talk about ancient archives and spirits, and I feel like that is what's happening with the game, where we're just saying things because we're supposed to say things in a fantasy, and there's no true story arc being developed. And I think this is reflecting back on the fans themselves, where they're giving this a massively low score, around the 2.8 area on Metacritic, where gamers are not enjoying this game. And I played it for an hour and a half, and I could concur with them. This is not a fun game to play. At least the dialogue, the characters, story arcs, everything surrounding the environment and the development of the story is just not interesting. And I think that's the thing I find most aggravating, because Dragon Age was supposed to be interesting, and most of all the characters themselves are supposed to be interesting, but they're so one-dimensional because the person creating this game is one-dimensional themselves. And I think it reflects back on the game that we're seeing right now, where everything is so simple and straightforward, where it just doesn't even feel like a fun game. The one plus I will give it, the combat is somewhat fun to a certain extent, but I can see it wearing on the minds of a player who's been playing this for a few hours, 10 hours, where you're like, Combat is not that interesting anymore, but for me, the first few 2 hours is somewhat fun, but it's a bit repetitive already. But I still had a little bit of fun with some of the combat. Everything else with the game, the dialogue is atrocious to go through. I had to control myself from skipping some scenes because it's just so redundant, repetitive, and most of all, useless. I felt like I was talking about something that didn't matter all the time, and they're saying the world's gonna end, but I'm like, is it really? We're all pretty relaxed about it, and it feels like we already have it solved and in the bag while we're playing this game. And I think that is just not the feeling you want from a Dragon Age game, where you have this feeling that everything is already solved already and you really don't need to do anything. And I think that's the feeling I get while playing this game, whereas yeah, we already solved it, even though they're saying the gods are just trying to destroy the world. But I feel like we already solved that issue because everything seems so easy going, easy flowing, and there's no stakes at the current moment. Even though they say the world's gonna end, it doesn't feel like the world's gonna end, and it feels like we're all sitting down eating breakfast and drinking coffee, discussing things that truly don't matter. And I think that's the thing I felt the most from some of the situations. It felt like we're just sitting down having breakfast too much times and talking without any urgency. And I think that sense of urgency being absent in the game is a little bit frustrating, at least for me. And I think it's showing in the charts with this game, where gamers are playing this game and they're simply not coming back after a while. I think if you would had gamers stay with the initial launch of the game, where it was around 50,000, it topped out at 70,000 before the next day reached 77,000, I think it would have reached at least 100K if players from the launch day stayed around. But I think a lot of players are not staying around. I don't think it's going to grow past maybe 100K. If it does, it still needs to make a lot more grounds in order to be comparable to some other games in its own genre that have come out. And I showed you before, there's no comparison. It needs to at least get 100,000 to be comparable to Starfield. And Starfield is a failure of a game that still reached over 330,000 people at its peak. So this not even breaking 100,000. This game is an absolute failure for BioWare and may even close down the studio if that is the case, because people are talking about a new Mass Effect game. If it's being done by the same writers and directors, we can expect an even worse game. And I think that's what gamers are going to expect, because they play Dragon Age and they know they make terrible games at BioWare now. There's no secret. You can't hide for 10 years. We know you're making a terrible game, and that's what we're expecting. You have to do the opposite right now. You have to work uphill and actually make a good game, and for that game to not be as popular initially because we're worried the game's going to be trash, but it gains word of mouth over a year and it does break records eventually and make profit. I think that is the position BioWare is in with this failure of a title, Dragon Age. They have to do some big things to change things and make this an actual profitable studio, because Dragon Age has put the nail in the coffin. I think at least 2 or 3 nails in the coffin for BioWare, because this is an annoying game to play. I have to say, from my experience, it feels like a game made by committee, a game made by people that are trying to follow these activist ideals to a T. It feels like a game made by the safe hands of modern day progressive philosophers that want to express their ideals to the gamers. And I feel those ideals expressed, and I'm bored and uninterested. And I think this is the result, the quintessential result of the modern game, where it's simply about nonsense and pronouns. I think that is the failure of a title right there, where it has nothing to say beyond that. And I think Dragon Age truly has nothing to say beyond that, at least from my experience and seeing the things other people are talking about, and the reviews are reflecting that. And I think that's the failure. For me, I would like to play a Dragon Age game. We're not playing that at all, and I feel it every time, every moment of the game, that this is not Dragon Age. This is something else, and it's not fun to play. But that's just my 2 cents on the situation. Maybe you disagree. Maybe you think that the game is actually good, and I'm happy for you. This game was actually made for you, I think. This was made for a specific audience. Unfortunately, the audience that plays this game is very small and will probably lead to the bankruptcy of your company if you're not spending money appropriately. And I don't think BioWare is spending money appropriate to this game. I think if you spent your money like Life is Strange Double Exposure, yeah, you might make some money back. So I think if you lower down the cost, this game might make money. But in the way it is, this is not made for the majority audience. This is not even a Dragon Age game, and that is a failure in of itself. But Dragon Age has been moving on from its own lore for a long time now, so I'm not really hateful about that. But it is a bad game in general so far. But what do you think is going to happen with Dragon Age? Do you think this is the biggest meltdown in the gaming industry so far, at least for a franchise? I think the Dragon Age series is officially history, and I don't see any way forward for this game. I think BioWare will soon follow as well. But you leave your thoughts, comments, like, share, comment, subscribe. This is Wagner Knows Why. Catch you next time.